The string quartet was playing something classical when my sister, Natalie, leaned into my fiancé, Elias. Her voice was perfectly calibrated to carry across the vineyard terrace. "You could do better than her," she purred, tracing the rim of her champagne glass. "Call me when you figure that out." Across the patio, my parents, Jennifer and Michael, chuckled as if she had just delivered the punchline to a brilliant joke. I did not drop my knife. I did not cry. I simply kept slicing our parents' anniversary cake into even perfect squares. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. For 27 years, my role in the family was clearly defined. I was the silent partner, the reliable safety net, the occupational therapist who methodically fixed broken things while my family enthusiastically broke them. Natalie was 29 and the undisputed golden child. Her entire life was a series of chaotic missteps that I was expected to finance and smooth over. When she wrecked her vehicle lease, my savings paid the penalty. When she racked up a 5-figure credit card debt, Jennifer and Michael demanded I cover her rent because, as they put it, I was the strong one. I was the dependable one. I was the one who could handle the pressure. People outside these dynamics often ask why targets of long-term family manipulation do not simply walk away the moment the abuse becomes apparent. They assume submission is a sign of inherent weakness, but that is a fundamental misunderstanding of the invisible chain of the survivor. I was not staying because I was fragile. I was trapped in a psychological prison that had no physical bars. It was a clinical manifestation of learned helplessness, systematically conditioned into my programming from childhood. Every single time I attempted to establish a boundary, my parents launched immediate, overwhelming guilt campaigns, framing my basic independence as a betrayal of our bloodline. They successfully programmed me to believe that my only value lay in my utility to their bottom line. Surviving that toxic environment did not mean fighting back loudly. It meant enduring silently until the pain became a familiar, predictable metric. But hearing Natalie openly proposition Elias while my parents laughed was the exact moment my conditioning snapped. The invisible chains dissolved instantly. I looked at the perfectly sliced pieces of vanilla sponge cake and realized my familial affection had never been a mutual relationship. It had been a mandatory subscription service, and I had been continuously footing the bill for a premium package of absolute disrespect. I did not storm off the vineyard terrace. I did not demand an apology. Anger was not loud or messy this time. It was purely clinical. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon a shred of regret, but there was only razor-sharp clarity. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. For the remainder of the anniversary party, I played my assigned part flawlessly. I served the cake. I smiled for the professional photographs. I paid the caterer $2,500, as my father insisted that the vendor be paid from my personal account to streamline the expense reporting, a classic maneuver he used to keep his own ledgers clean. But internally, the emotional ledger had been zeroed out completely. The family I thought I was selflessly supporting was nothing more than a fraudulent enterprise, and it was finally time to liquidate my assets and close the account. The drive back to our apartment that evening was completely silent. I watched the city lights blur past the passenger window, my mind already drafting a comprehensive exit strategy. When we finally walked through our front door, Elias did not offer me platitudes or empty comfort. He simply walked into his home office, unlocked his safe, and handed me a sleek external hard drive. "I have been documenting them for 8 months," he stated, his voice as calm and architectural as his profession. Every passive-aggressive comment, every time they demanded money, every dinner where Natalie tried to undermine you. I recorded it because I knew that when the day finally came for you to cut them off, they would try to gaslight you into thinking you were the crazy one. I stared at the small silver drive resting in my palm. My fiancé had not just been a passive observer to my exploitation. He had been the meticulous archivist of my family's emotional bankruptcy. We sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and began the work. I did not shed a single tear as we listened to the audio files. Hearing my parents orchestrate my financial ruin in high definition removed any lingering hesitation, but the audio files were merely the entry point. The real work began when we accessed the financial records. As I had been managing the family's bookkeeping and tax preparations for years due to my father's negligence, I still retained access to the digital banking portals, which had not been updated for security purposes. We initiated a systematic forensic audit of a decade of family finances. I tracked every dollar I had given them, every emergency loan that was never repaid, every credit card statement I had bailed out. It was deep into the second night of our audit when we found the anomaly. It was buried in a series of obscure wire transfers dating back to when I turned 18. My grandmother had left a trust fund meant for my education and future home. I had always been told by Michael and Jennifer that the fund had been decimated by market crashes and administrative fees, leaving barely enough to cover my occupational therapy textbooks. The bank statements told a wildly different story. The money had not vanished into the market. It had been systematically and purposefully siphoned off. Elias and I tracked the routing numbers directly to an account held solely by Natalie. My parents had legally facilitated the embezzlement of my entire inheritance, funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars to their golden child while I worked exhausting double shifts to pay off my student loans. The betrayal was absolute, but my pulse did not quicken. There was no panic, just the cold, mechanical hum of a trap snapping shut. They had crossed the line from emotional parasites to actual criminals. We printed the documents, categorized the evidence, and placed everything into pristine leather binders. The rehearsal dinner for our wedding was scheduled for Friday night. It was going to be a spectacular presentation. Friday evening arrived with suffocating humidity, but the climate control inside the luxury ballroom of the Grand Hotel was perfectly calibrated. The rehearsal dinner was a masterclass in superficial elegance. Waitstaff circulated with silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres while the scent of imported orchids filled the air. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive glow over 75 of our closest friends and family members. Michael and Jennifer were working the room, holding court near the open bar, projecting the image of wealthy, supportive parents. I sat at the head table beside Elias, sipping sparkling water, feeling nothing but the satisfying weight of the leather portfolio resting discreetly on the chair beside me. I was the silent observer to my own impending execution of justice. The dinner progressed through 3 flawless courses before the clinking of a spoon against crystal commanded the room's attention. Natalie stood up. She wore a designer dress that I had indirectly paid for, her smile radiant and completely toxic. She raised her champagne flute, waiting for the ambient chatter to die down. This was her moment. This was the stage she had demanded. "I want to propose a toast to my little sister, Madeline," Natalie began, her voice dripping with weaponized sweetness. We all know Madeline is the practical one, the sensible one, the one who works so hard because, let's be honest, she never had the natural charm to just skate by. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the audience. My parents beamed with pride at their golden child. "Elias," she continued, turning her gaze to my fiancé, "you are taking on a lot of responsibility. Madeline can be so rigid, so focused on her little spreadsheets and rules. It takes a very patient man to deal with someone who lacks spontaneity. But we are a forgiving family, and we are just so relieved she finally found someone willing to put up with her." She paused, preparing to deliver the final, shaming punchline. She expected me to lower my eyes. She expected me to swallow the humiliation to maintain the fragile illusion of family harmony. She expected the same compliant sister she had exploited for 2 decades. I did not lower my eyes. I stood up. My movement was so sudden, so lacking in my usual deference, that Natalie actually stopped speaking mid-sentence. The room fell into a dead, absolute silence. I picked up the heavy leather portfolio from the chair beside me and placed it squarely on the pristine white tablecloth. "Thank you for that incredibly illuminating toast, Natalie," I said. My voice did not shake. It resonated through the ballroom, cold and precise, cutting through the warm air like a scalpel. It is fascinating that you mention my focus on spreadsheets and rules, because as it turns out, my rigid attention to detail is exactly what brings us to the main event of the evening. I unclasped the portfolio. The snap of the metal fastener echoed loudly in the quiet room. "I have prepared a presentation for everyone here. Consider it a comprehensive review of our family's accounting." The reckoning had officially commenced. I pulled the first stack of documents from the portfolio. They were printed on heavy, high-quality paper. "These are the originals," I stated, handing a thick packet to Elias, who systematically began passing copies to his parents and the groomsmen seated nearby. I believe in transparency, especially when starting a new marriage. So, I am making our family's financial history completely transparent tonight. I turned my attention directly to Natalie, whose smug expression was rapidly dissolving into confusion. Natalie loves to joke about my lack of charm and my exhausting work ethic. What she neglected to mention in her toast is that my double shifts at the clinic were funding her lifestyle. But emotional and financial parasitism is just a character flaw. What we have here is fundamentally different. I held up a certified bank statement, printed directly from the institution holding the accounts, the numbers highlighted in stark, undeniable yellow. When I turned 18, my grandmother left a trust fund explicitly designated for my future. For 9 years, Michael and Jennifer assured me the funds were lost to market volatility and administrative fees. I believed them because I operated under the foolish assumption that parents do not steal from their children. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. I saw Elias's mother cover her mouth in shock. My father's face drained of all color, his wine glass freezing halfway to his mouth. If you look at page 3 of your packets, I instructed the room, my tone entirely instructional, like a professor conducting a seminar. You will see the exact wire transfers, $342,000. It did not evaporate into the stock market. It was systematically transferred by my parents into a private account registered solely to Natalie. "Madeline, stop this right now," my mother shrieked, her carefully cultivated socialite persona shattering instantly. She lunged forward, trying to grab the papers from the nearest guest. "You are having a psychological breakdown. These are lies." "They are certified bank records obtained through a forensic audit, Jennifer," I corrected her, refusing to use the title of mother. "There is zero room for interpretation. You and Michael legally facilitated the embezzlement of my inheritance to fund Natalie's luxury vehicle, her designer wardrobe, and her endless credit card debt. You stole my future to subsidize her vanity." The shock waving through the ballroom was palpable. Guests were flipping through the documents, their eyes widening as they processed the undeniable proof. The quiet murmurs swelled into a harsh, undeniable chorus of judgment. They weren't whispering about the rigid, uncharming sister anymore. They were staring at a trio of thieves who had dressed up in formal wear to drink my champagne. I looked at Natalie. She was trembling, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. The power dynamic in the room had inverted completely. I was no longer the silent partner footing the bill. I was the auditor, and the final balance was due. The collapse of their meticulously crafted public image was instantaneous and absolute. Michael stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing silently, utterly stripped of his usual arrogant authority. He instinctively scanned the room, attempting to leverage his old connections and social influence to de-escalate the tension, but his peers, men who had respected his facade for years, simply turned their backs, refusing to even acknowledge his presence. Jennifer had collapsed back into her chair, hiding her face behind her hands as the wealthy friends she had spent years trying to impress stared at her with unfiltered disgust. But Natalie could not accept defeat. Her entire existence depended on controlling the narrative. She stepped out from behind the head table, her face flushed dark red, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You are twisting this!" Natalie screamed, her voice shrill and echoing painfully across the crystal and porcelain. "You are trying to ruin my life because you have always been jealous of me." Mom and Dad gave me that money because I needed it, because I actually had potential to do something with my life. "You used $342,000 to fund a lifestyle you could not earn," I replied, my voice remaining perfectly level. "That is not potential. That is theft." "I deserved it," she shrieked, totally unraveling in front of 75 horrified witnesses. She knocked over her champagne glass, the expensive liquid spilling across the white linen, mirroring the absolute mess she had made of her own life. The mask was completely gone, leaving only the entitled, frantic child underneath. "You were just going to waste it on paying off boring student loans and sitting in some depressing clinic. I was building a brand. I was building a network." "Mom and Dad knew I deserved the investment more than you did. You owe us for putting up with your boring, miserable attitude for your entire life." The room went deathly quiet. Natalie had just confessed. In her desperate attempt to justify her actions, she had publicly validated every single document in the leather portfolio. She stood panting, staring at the disgusted faces of the guests, the realization of what she had just admitted slowly crashing down on her. Thank you for clarifying the family business model, Natalie, I said, my tone icy and final. You genuinely believe that existing as my sister entitled you to my assets. But as of tonight, this enterprise is officially bankrupt. I turned to Michael and Jennifer, who were actively shrinking under the weight of the room's judgment. You weren't shocked by what you had done to me. You were only shocked that I stopped playing along and paying the invoices. I have already engaged with a criminal defense attorney and forensic accountants to submit our evidence to the district attorney's office. Formal complaints for grand larceny and wire fraud are currently being processed. I picked up my clutch from the table and looked at the three of them one last time. There was no sadness, no lingering attachment. They were simply bad debt that I was finally writing off. Elias and I are leaving. You three can stay and explain yourselves to the guests. Do not attempt to contact me. You cannot afford my rates anymore. The legal and financial fallout was swift, methodical, and completely merciless. Within 72 hours of the rehearsal dinner, Michael and Jennifer were placed under formal investigation by the district attorney's office, with charges pending based on the overwhelming evidence. The sheer volume of evidence Elias and I had compiled left their defense attorneys with virtually no leverage. Because my parents stubbornly leveraged their own home equity to cover Natalie's rapidly escalating legal defense fees, the bank initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings on their property within 6 months. They instantaneously lost their elite country club memberships, their wealthy social circle, and their carefully constructed societal standing. They were ultimately reduced to renting a cramped, outdated 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, their entire retirement portfolio completely wiped out by court-ordered restitution payments. Natalie's descent was even steeper. Stripped of the stolen trust funds she used to desperately maintain her artificial influencer lifestyle, her personal brand collapsed practically overnight. Without my financial safety net to catch her inevitable freefall, she was legally forced to declare bankruptcy. Without my ongoing subsidies, she could not maintain the loan repayments on her assets, leading to a cascade of defaults, repossession of her luxury vehicle, and eventually, a forced bankruptcy filing. The last I heard through the legal grapevine, she was working a minimum wage retail job, furiously blaming the universe for a catastrophic disaster she had entirely orchestrated herself. Elias and I did not cancel our marriage. We simply relocated the event to a quiet, beautiful courthouse ceremony with only his family and our genuinely supportive friends in attendance. We managed to recoup a portion of the venue deposits and redirected the remaining wedding budget, which we had been aggressively saving, directly toward a specialized business investment. With the successfully recovered funds from my grandmother's trust, I established a specialized occupational therapy and counseling clinic specifically designed to assist individuals recovering from severe financial and emotional family exploitation. I needed to create a structured, safe harbor for people who had been systematically drained by the exact individuals who were legally and morally supposed to protect them. This pivotal business decision fundamentally shifted my perspective on what had occurred. It elevated my actions from simple retaliation to the justice of the sower. True justice is not merely the justice of punishment, which obsessively focuses on the destruction of the past. It is the justice of the sower, which focuses purposefully on building a future. By transforming the exact money they had criminally stolen into a foundation that actively protected others, I executed the ultimate act of justice, rendering their original cruelty completely powerless and utterly insignificant. I've come to realize that holding on to resentment is like carrying a bad debt on your own ledger. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. True freedom frequently requires recognizing that a bridge is entirely toxic and having the absolute courage to burn it down to the foundation. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that made you sick. I had to permanently sever the ties with Michael, Jennifer, and Natalie to finally build a life where I was valued as a human being, not exploited as a commodity. If you've ever had to set a boundary with someone who refused to respect it, share your story in the comments. We read every single one, and you aren't alone.